After years of military service, I was finally coming home for Christmas, but just days before, my dad sent a message: "You are not welcome here anymore." Mom added, "Don't bother showing up or you'll find the house empty." I simply replied, "Understood." 5 days later, I woke up to 10 missed calls from my family and one was from their lawyer. It was too late to undo. I'm writing this from my apartment in San Diego, 3 months after what I now call the Christmas incident. My hands are still shaking as I type this, not from fear, but from the adrenaline rush that comes with finally getting justice after years of being treated like garbage by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. My name is Daniel Martinez, and I'm 28 years old. I've been serving in the Marines for the past 7 years, with 3 deployments overseas. I joined straight out of high school, much to my parents' disappointment. They wanted me to go to college, get some boring office job, and live the suburban dream they had mapped out for me. But I had different plans. My father, Frank Martinez, is a successful insurance broker who's always measured success by bank account balances and social status. My mother, Teresa Martinez, is a real estate agent who cares more about appearances than actual substance. They live in a McMansion in an upscale neighborhood in Phoenix, Arizona, the kind of place where everyone drives luxury cars and pretends their lives are perfect. Growing up, I was never the golden child. That honor belonged to my younger sister Megan Martinez Thompson, who's now 25 and works as a marketing coordinator for some tech startup. She's always been the favorite, the one who went to college, got the respectable job, and married her college sweetheart, Andrew Thompson, who works in finance. They live in a trendy apartment downtown and post Instagram photos of their brunches and weekend trips. Then there's my younger brother Lucas Martinez, who's 23 and still lives at home while finding himself. He dropped out of college twice, has never held a job for more than 6 months, and spends most of his time playing video games in the basement. But somehow, he's still more welcomed at family gatherings than I am. The problem started almost immediately after I enlisted. My parents saw my military service as an embarrassment, something to be downplayed at their country club gatherings. When their friends asked about their children, they'd gush about Megan's marketing campaigns and Lucas's artistic pursuits. He makes TikTok videos, but when it came to me, I'd get a dismissive "Daniel's in the military" followed by a quick subject change. Over the years, the distance grew. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Care packages stopped coming after my first deployment. When I'd come home on leave, I'd get the distinct feeling that I was disrupting their perfect little world. They'd make passive-aggressive comments about my lifestyle choices and ask when I was going to get serious about my future. The breaking point came last year during Thanksgiving. I had flown home after a particularly difficult deployment, dealing with some heavy stuff that I couldn't talk about due to security clearances. I was looking forward to some family time, maybe opening up about what I'd been through. Instead, I walked into a house full of Megan's in-laws and my parents' country club friends. The entire evening, I felt like a prop in their perfect family display. When someone asked about my service, my father quickly changed the subject to Megan's recent promotion. When I tried to contribute to conversations about current events, topics I actually had first-hand experience with, I was either ignored or patronized. The final straw came when my mother pulled me aside and told me that my presence was making the guests uncomfortable because I looked too serious and wasn't socializing properly. She suggested I might be happier eating in the kitchen while they entertained in the dining room. I left that night and didn't speak to them for months. But this year was supposed to be different. I had been promoted to staff sergeant, and I was being transferred to a new base in California. I'd been deployed for 10 months straight, missing birthdays, holidays, and family milestones. I was exhausted, homesick, and despite everything, I still loved my family. I wanted to try one more time. In November, I reached out to my mother to let her know I'd be coming home for Christmas. I explained that this would likely be my last Christmas leave for a while since I'd be starting a new assignment in January. I thought maybe they'd be excited to see me, maybe we could finally work things out. Her response was lukewarm at best. She said they already had plans but I could probably squeeze in somewhere. No enthusiasm, no "we can't wait to see you," just logistical accommodation. I should have seen the writing on the wall, but hope can make you blind to obvious signs. 2 weeks before Christmas, I got a text from my father: "Daniel, after much discussion, Teresa and I have decided that you're not welcome here anymore. Your attitude and lifestyle choices have become incompatible with our family values. Please make other arrangements for the holidays." I stared at that message for a solid 10 minutes, reading it over and over, trying to process what I was seeing. My lifestyle choices? I was serving my country, following orders, and trying to make them proud. What lifestyle choices was he referring to? Before I could even respond, another message came through, this time from my mother: "Don't bother showing up or you'll find the house empty. We're going to Megan's for Christmas and you're not invited there either. Maybe it's time you started spending holidays with people who actually appreciate your choices." The dismissal was so casual, so final, that it took my breath away. 8 years of service, 3 deployments, months away from everything familiar, and this was how they chose to communicate with me. Not a phone call, not even a conversation, just cold, impersonal text messages cutting me out of their lives. I sat in my barracks room that night, staring at my phone, cycling through emotions I didn't even know I could feel simultaneously. Hurt, anger, disappointment, relief, and something else, a cold, calculating clarity that I'd only felt in combat situations. I typed and deleted a dozen responses. I wanted to call them, to yell, to demand explanations, to beg them to reconsider. But then I remembered something my drill instructor had told us during basic training: sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. So I sent back a single word: understood. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I did what I always do when I need to think clearly: I started making lists and gathering information. Years of military training had taught me that knowledge is power, and preparation is everything. See, there were things about my family's financial situation that they didn't know I knew. Things I'd discovered over the years during my visits home, little details that had accumulated into a bigger picture they probably never expected me to piece together. My parents had always been terrible with money, despite their high incomes. They lived far beyond their means, financing their lifestyle with credit cards, home equity loans, and poor investment decisions. My father's insurance business had been struggling for years due to his gambling problem, something he thought he'd hidden from everyone. My mother's real estate income was sporadic at best, and she'd been caught inflating her listings and had been fined by the Real Estate Commission multiple times. But here's the kicker: their house, their beautiful McMansion that they'd been using as their personal ATM through refinancing and home equity loans, wasn't actually in their names anymore. 3 years ago, when my grandfather died, he left his entire estate to me. Not to my parents, not split between the grandkids, to me specifically. The will was very clear about this, and it had been a source of family tension that everyone pretended didn't exist. My grandfather, Frank Martinez Sr., had been a Marine in Korea. He understood what service meant, and he'd been the only family member who was genuinely proud of my career choice. Before he died, he'd pulled me aside and told me that he was leaving me everything because he knew I'd use it responsibly and because he wanted to ensure I'd always have something that was truly mine. The estate was substantial, about $2.3 million in total assets, including cash, investments, and several properties. But there was one property in particular that my parents had forgotten about, or chosen to ignore. Their house, the one they'd been living in for 15 years, was built on land that my grandfather had purchased in the 1970s. When they wanted to build their dream home, he'd agreed to let them use the land with the understanding that they'd purchase it from him over time with a formal agreement to be drawn up later. They'd made sporadic payments over the years, maybe $30,000 total over 15 years, but never enough to establish any real equity, and the promised formal purchase agreement was never created. The deed had remained in his name, and when he died, it became part of my inheritance. Technically, legally, my parents had been living on my land for the past 3 years without any formal lease agreement. They'd just assumed that because they were family, it would all work out somehow. They'd even been using the land as collateral for loans, which was fraudulent since they didn't actually own it. I'd known about this situation since the will was read, but I'd never brought it up because I didn't want to disrupt their lives. I figured we'd work something out eventually. Maybe I'd sell it to them for a reasonable price, or we'd formalize a lease agreement. I certainly never intended to use it against them. Until they decided I wasn't welcome in their family anymore. That night, after receiving their dismissive text messages, I made some phone calls. But first, I did something I'd been trained to do in the Marines: I blocked their phone numbers temporarily. I needed time to think clearly without emotional manipulation or desperate calls that would cloud my judgment. The first was to my grandfather's lawyer, Thomas Mitchell, who had been handling the estate. He was semi-retired but still took my calls because he'd known my grandfather for decades. "Daniel," he said when I explained the situation, "I've been wondering when you were going to address the property situation. Legally, you've been quite generous allowing them to remain there without any formal agreement. What are my options?" I asked. "Well, since there's no lease agreement and they haven't made substantial payments that would create ownership interest, you could initiate eviction proceedings. Given that they've been using the property as loan collateral without ownership, there might also be fraud implications, but that would be a separate matter." I asked him about timelines, and he explained that in Arizona, eviction proceedings for occupants without formal tenancy agreements typically take 45 to 60 days, though it could be expedited in cases involving fraud. "How quickly could we start this process?" I asked. "If you're serious about this, I could file the paperwork first thing Monday morning. But Daniel, are you sure this is what you want to do? This is your family we're talking about." I thought about their text messages, about years of dismissal and condescension, about being told I wasn't welcome in their home, a home that was legally mine. They made their choice, I told him. File the paperwork. The next call was to my buddy Derek, who worked in financial investigations for the military. I couldn't give him specific details, but I asked him about resources for investigating potential loan fraud. He pointed me toward some civilian contacts who specialized in financial crimes. By the time the sun came up, I had a plan. Over the next few days, I worked methodically. I hired a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud cases. He'd come recommended by a Marine buddy who'd used him in a divorce case. I arranged for a lawyer who handled property disputes to manage the eviction process properly. I even consulted with a criminal defense attorney to understand the potential legal ramifications of my parents' financial activities. The investigation would take time. The PI explained that financial records from multiple institutions would need to be gathered and analyzed, especially with the upcoming holidays when many offices would be closed. We agreed that any reports would be compiled after New Year's to ensure accuracy and completeness. I didn't do any of this out of spite or anger, at least, not entirely. I did it because I'd finally realized that my family had been taking advantage of my good nature for years, and it was time to establish some boundaries. If they wanted to treat me like an outsider, then they needed to understand that outsiders don't get family privileges. The eviction notice was served on December 23, 2 days before Christmas. According to my attorney, my father answered the door and immediately started arguing with the process server, insisting there had been some mistake. The server simply handed him the papers and left. What my parents didn't know was that I had also arranged for the private investigator to begin his formal documentation process, though the actual financial investigation reports wouldn't be completed until after the holidays when institutions reopened. I temporarily unblocked their phone numbers on Christmas Eve, knowing they would try to reach me once they processed what the eviction notice meant. See, when you've been trained in strategic operations, you learn that half measures don't work. If you're going to take action, you take complete action. You don't leave loose ends that can come back to bite you later. But I also learned that timing matters. Rushing into action during the holidays when government offices and financial institutions are operating with skeleton crews would only create confusion and potentially weaken my position legally. The eviction notice was time sensitive and needed to be served promptly, but the broader financial investigation could wait until after New Year's when proper procedures could be followed. I learned all of this from my attorney, who had been fielding increasingly frantic calls from my parents throughout the day. They'd tried to reach me directly, but since I'd only temporarily unblocked them for Christmas Eve, they couldn't get through yet. I wasn't ready to deal with their emotional manipulation and sob stories. I needed time to process what I'd set in motion and to prepare for the inevitable confrontation. That evening, I sat in my hotel room in Oceanside, looking out at the ocean and trying to figure out how I felt about everything. Part of me felt vindicated. Finally, after years of being treated like a disappointment, I had shown them what real consequences looked like. But another part of me felt hollow, like I'd won a battle but lost something important in the process. I thought about Christmases from my childhood, back when things were simpler. When I was 8 or 9, before the family dynamics became so toxic, I remembered feeling genuinely excited about coming home for the holidays. My parents used to be proud of me then, when I brought home good grades or won awards at school. But somewhere along the way, their pride had become conditional on me meeting their expectations rather than celebrating my achievements. The military had taught me that respect isn't given, it's earned. But it had also taught me that once earned, respect should be maintained through consistent behavior and mutual trust. My parents had failed on both counts. They'd never truly respected my choices, and they'd certainly never maintained any trust in our relationship. I pulled out my laptop and started typing an email to my commanding officer, explaining the family situation and requesting an extension of my Christmas leave. I didn't go into all the details, but I mentioned that there were some legal matters I needed to address before returning to base. He responded within an hour, granting me an additional week of leave and asking if I needed any assistance with legal resources. That's the thing about the military, when you're dealing with family crisis, your brothers and sisters in arms rally around you. They don't judge you or make you feel like you're being dramatic. They just offer practical support and let you know you're not alone. It was a stark contrast to how my biological family had treated me over the years. Christmas Eve was surreal. I spent it with my buddy Marcus and his family in Carlsbad. His wife, Jennifer, had insisted on inviting me after Marcus explained what was happening with my family. Their kids, ages 6 and 8, treated me like I was their favorite uncle, showing me their toys and asking me to tell them stories about being a Marine. Watching Marcus interact with his children reminded me of what healthy family relationships look like. He was patient with them, interested in their thoughts and feelings, and genuinely proud of their accomplishments, even the small ones. When his 6-year-old daughter showed me a drawing she'd made, Marcus didn't dismiss it or compare it to something his 8-year-old son had done. He celebrated it as a unique expression of her creativity. That's what I'd been missing my entire life, unconditional positive regard from the people who were supposed to love me most. Instead, I'd gotten conditional acceptance based on whether my choices aligned with their vision of success. Jennifer made sure I felt included in all their Christmas Eve traditions. We made cookies together, watched Christmas movies, and played board games. When it came time to open presents, they'd even bought me a small gift, a book about Marine Corps history that they'd picked up at a local bookstore. It was thoughtful and appropriate, showing that they'd actually listened when I talked about my interests. As I watched their family celebrate together, I realized that what I'd done to my parents wasn't really about revenge. It was about finally standing up for myself and demanding the respect I deserved. I'd spent 8 years trying to earn their approval by being the perfect son, the perfect Marine, the perfect everything. But perfect isn't enough when people have already decided you're not worth their time. That night, I called my grandfather's lawyer, Thomas Mitchell, to check on the status of everything. He informed me that my parents had been trying to reach him all day, but since he represented my interests in the estate matter, he couldn't discuss the situation with them without my permission. "They're in a panic, Daniel," he said. "Your father's business is essentially finished, and they're facing some serious financial consequences. Are you prepared for how this might escalate?" "What do you mean?" I asked. Well, they're going to fight this. They're going to hire lawyers, probably try to challenge your grandfather's will, maybe even claim that you're acting out of spite rather than legitimate business interests. It's going to get ugly, and it's going to be expensive for everyone involved. I thought about that for a moment. Tom, let me ask you something. If I were just some random person who had inherited this property, and I discovered that people were living on it illegally and using it as loan collateral, what would you advise me to do? I'd tell you to protect your interests and enforce your legal rights, he said without hesitation. That's exactly what I'm doing. The fact that these people happen to be related to me doesn't change the legal reality of the situation. Fair enough. But Daniel, be prepared for them to make this personal. They're going to try to make you look like the bad guy, like you're destroying your family over a property dispute. They destroyed the family relationship long before this property dispute, I said. I'm just declining to subsidize their lifestyle anymore. Christmas morning was when everything came to a head. I was spending Christmas with some Marine buddies in Oceanside, trying to have a good time despite everything, when my phone started buzzing after I unblocked the numbers. The first call came from my mother at 6:47 a.m. on Christmas morning. I let it go to voicemail. Then my father called. Voicemail. Megan called 3 times in a row. Voicemail. Even Lucas called, which was surprising since we barely spoke under normal circumstances. By noon, I had 10 missed calls and twice as many text messages, ranging from confused, "Mike, what's going on?" to angry, "You can't do this to us," to desperate, "Please call us back so we can work this out." The last call was from a number I didn't recognize. The voicemail was from Thomas Mitchell, my grandfather's lawyer, but he wasn't calling on my behalf this time. "Daniel, this is Tom Mitchell. Your father has retained me to discuss the property situation. I've explained to him that there's a conflict of interest since I'm handling your grandfather's estate, so I've referred him to another attorney. I wanted to give you a heads up that they're likely going to try to challenge this legally. Call me when you get a chance." That's when it hit me, it was too late for them to undo this. Once the legal process started, once they'd been officially served, once they'd hired lawyers and made this into a formal dispute, there was no going back to the way things were. I could have called them back. I could have explained my position, maybe worked out a compromise. But honestly, I didn't want to. For the first time in years, I felt like I had some control over the situation. They'd spent so long making me feel unwelcome, making me feel like I was the problem, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to have the upper hand. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal activity. My parents hired a lawyer who immediately filed for an emergency restraining order to stop the eviction. They claimed they had made substantial improvements to the property and had partial ownership rights based on their payments over the years. Meanwhile, in early January, the private investigator completed his comprehensive report. The findings were more damaging than I'd expected. My father had indeed been using client funds to cover personal debts, including substantial gambling losses. The use of my property as collateral was clearly documented across multiple loan applications. I authorized the PI to submit his findings to the appropriate authorities and financial institutions. Within a week of the report's submission, the cascade of consequences began. The mortgage company froze their home equity line of credit. Credit card companies closed accounts backed by fraudulent collateral. Most significantly, the Arizona Department of Insurance suspended my father's license and opened a criminal investigation. What made their situation even more complicated was that word of their financial troubles had spread through their social circle. Phoenix's upper-middle-class community is smaller than people think, and news of my father's license suspension and their potential eviction had become the subject of country club gossip. The same people they'd been trying to impress for years were now whispering about their downfall behind their backs. Megan Martinez Thompson called me during this period, absolutely furious about the social embarrassment. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to our family's reputation?" she demanded. "Andrew's coworkers are asking him about it. My friends are sending me links to news articles about Dad's business troubles. We can't show our faces anywhere without people staring." "Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided I wasn't worth having around," I replied calmly. "This isn't about you being around or not around, Mike. This is about you destroying everything our family has built just because you got your feelings hurt." "Megan, what exactly did our family build? A facade of success based on fraud and borrowed money? A reputation built on excluding the family member who was actually serving his country? What am I destroying, exactly?" She couldn't answer that, which told me everything I needed to know. Meanwhile, my parents' lawyer was scrambling to find some legal foothold that would allow them to remain in the house. They tried to argue adverse possession, claiming they'd been living on the property long enough to establish ownership rights. But adverse possession requires that the occupation be hostile and without the owner's permission, and my grandfather had clearly given them permission to use the land. They tried to claim that there was an implied contract for the land sale, but they couldn't produce any documentation showing agreed upon terms or purchase price. They also argued that their $30,000 in payments over 15 years, plus improvements to the property, entitled them to compensation, but $30,000 over 15 years on a property worth over $300,000 didn't establish significant equity. Their lawyer was good, but not good enough. The restraining order was denied because they couldn't prove they had any legal right to remain on the property. The judge was particularly unimpressed when it came to light that they'd been using property they didn't own as collateral for loans. The hearing was a revelation for me. I attended via video conference from California, watching as my parents sat in the courtroom looking smaller and more defeated than I'd ever seen them. When the judge asked them to explain their use of the property as loan collateral, my father broke down completely. He admitted to the gambling problem, the business irregularities, and the desperate financial decisions he'd been making for years. It was the first time I'd ever seen my father be completely honest about anything, and it was happening in front of a judge in a legal proceeding rather than in a conversation with his family. That hurt more than I'd expected it to. After the hearing, their lawyer called me directly. "Mr. Martinez, your parents are in a very difficult position. Is there any possibility of working out some kind of arrangement that would allow them to remain in the property while they get back on their feet?" "What kind of arrangement?" I asked. "Perhaps a lease agreement with reasonable terms, or a rent-to-own situation that would allow them to eventually purchase the property from you?" I thought about it for about 30 seconds. "Their track record with financial agreements isn't exactly stellar," I said. "They've had 3 years to address this situation, and instead of talking to me about it, they chose to use my property fraudulently as loan collateral. Why should I trust them with a lease agreement?" "Because they're your family," the lawyer said, playing what he probably thought was his trump card. "They're the ones who decided I wasn't family anymore," I replied. "I'm just respecting their decision." Meanwhile, my private investigator had uncovered some interesting information about my father's business practices. Apparently, the gambling problem was worse than I'd thought, and he'd been borrowing from client accounts to cover his debts. It wasn't technically embezzlement since he'd been paying the money back, but it was definitely insurance fraud, and it opened up a whole other can of legal worms. By New Year's Day, my parents were facing not just eviction, but potential criminal charges for fraud. Their lawyer was now recommending they consider bankruptcy to protect their remaining assets. Megan called me on January 2nd, and this time I answered. "Mike, what the hell is wrong with you?" were her first words. "Hello to you too, Megan. Do you have any idea what you've done to Mom and Dad? They might go to prison." "I didn't do anything to them," I said calmly. "I simply exercised my legal rights as a property owner. Everything else is a consequence of their own actions." "This is about Christmas, isn't it? You're destroying our family because you got your feelings hurt?" That stung because there was some truth to it, but not the way she meant it. "Megan, let me ask you something. When was the last time Mom or Dad asked me how I was doing? When was the last time they showed any interest in my life, my career, my well-being? When was the last time they treated me like I was actually part of this family?" She was quiet for a moment. "They're proud of you, Mike. They just don't know how to show it. By telling me I'm not welcome in their home? By uninviting me from Christmas? By making me feel like an embarrassment for the past 8 years? They were just stressed about money problems that they created by living beyond their means and making illegal financial decisions," I interrupted. "Megan, they've been using land they don't own as collateral for loans. That's fraud. I didn't make them do that." "So you're going to let them go to prison? Your own parents?" I sighed. "I'm not letting them do anything. I'm just not protecting them from the consequences of their actions anymore. There's a difference." The conversation ended with her hanging up on me, but it clarified something important in my mind. My family had gotten so used to me being the accommodating one, the one who absorbed their criticism and disappointment without fighting back, that they genuinely couldn't understand why I wasn't rushing to fix this situation for them. Over the next month, the legal situation continued to evolve. My parents' lawyer managed to negotiate a deal with the prosecutor that would allow my father to avoid criminal charges if he agreed to make restitution to his clients and surrender his insurance license permanently. It would essentially end his career, but it would keep him out of prison. The eviction proceeded as scheduled. My parents had to be out of the house by February 28th. The court had granted them the standard 45-day notice period. They moved in with Megan and Andrew Thompson temporarily, which caused its own set of family drama as Andrew wasn't thrilled about having his in-laws living in their 2-bedroom apartment. Lucas Martinez finally got a job, his first real job ever, because he needed money to help with the family crisis. The irony wasn't lost on me that it took destroying their financial stability to finally motivate him to become a productive member of society. As for the house, I decided to sell it. I didn't want to live there myself, and I certainly didn't want to rent it back to my parents. The property was worth significantly more than what they owed on their various loans. After paying off their debts, about $650,000 in total between the fraudulent home equity line, credit cards, and other obligations, there was still about $180,000 left over from the $830,000 sale price. Here's where I surprised everyone, including myself. I didn't keep the money. Instead, I set up a trust fund. The remaining proceeds from the sale were divided into 3 equal parts of $60,000 each. One part went to a fund for Lucas Martinez's education, contingent on him maintaining steady employment and enrollment in either college or trade school. One part went to a fund for Megan's future children's education, because despite everything, I wanted my future nieces and nephews to have opportunities. The final part went to my parents, but with conditions. They could access the money for basic living expenses, but only through a trustee who would ensure it wasn't gambled away or spent on luxury items they couldn't afford. It was enough to help them get back on their feet, but it wouldn't allow them to return to their previous unsustainable lifestyle. I also included one additional condition in the trust documents. If any of them wanted to access their portions of the fund, they had to write me a letter acknowledging their role in the family dysfunction and apologizing for their treatment of me over the years. Not because I needed their apologies to feel better, but because I needed to know they understood why this had all happened. Lucas Martinez was the first to write. His letter was awkward and clearly uncomfortable, but it was genuine. He admitted that he'd been jealous of my discipline and success, and that he'd gone along with my parents' dismissive attitude toward my military service because it was easier than standing up for me. He thanked me for forcing him to get a job and for setting up the education fund, and he promised to make better choices going forward. Megan's letter took longer, but when it came, it was more thoughtful than I'd expected. She acknowledged that she'd been complicit in my marginalization because it benefited her to be the golden child. She admitted that she'd always known my parents treated me unfairly, but she'd chosen to ignore it because addressing it would have been uncomfortable. She apologized for prioritizing her own comfort over her brother's well-being. My parents' letter was the most difficult to read. It was clear that losing everything had forced them to confront some hard truths about themselves. My father admitted to his gambling problem and acknowledged that he'd been taking his financial stress out on me because I represented everything he felt he'd failed to achieve. My mother acknowledged that she'd been more concerned with appearances than with actually supporting her children's choices, and that she'd allowed social pressure to influence how she treated her own son. They both apologized for the Christmas messages and admitted that they'd sent them during a particularly stressful moment when they were dealing with financial pressures I hadn't known about. They explained that they'd been afraid I'd discover their financial problems and judge them the way they'd been judging me for years. Reading those letters didn't magically fix 8 years of hurt and disappointment, but it was a start. It's been 3 months since what I call the Christmas incident, and I'm still processing everything that happened. My relationship with my family is complicated now in ways it never was before. There's honesty that wasn't there previously, but there's also awareness on both sides. Lucas Martinez and I talk regularly now. He's doing well in his job and has started taking business classes at the local community college. He says he wants to understand finances so he doesn't make the same mistakes our parents made. Megan Martinez Thompson and I are slowly rebuilding our relationship. She and Andrew ended up buying a house with some help from her trust fund, and she's been making an effort to include me in their lives in ways she never did before. She asks about my work, shares details about her life, and has even started sending care packages to my new base. My parents and I have spoken several times, usually brief phone calls that are still somewhat awkward. They're living in a modest apartment now and seem to be adjusting to a simpler lifestyle. My father is working as a customer service representative for an insurance company, a significant step down from owning his own agency, but it's honest work with a steady paycheck. My mother has scaled back her real estate activities and taken a part-time job at a local school. They've both thanked me for the trust fund and admitted that having financial constraints has actually reduced their stress levels. They no longer have to keep up appearances or maintain a lifestyle they couldn't afford. I'm not sure we'll ever have a traditional family relationship, but we're building something new that might actually be healthier than what we had before. The most unexpected outcome of all this was the impact it had on my own life. Standing up to my family, setting boundaries, and following through on consequences gave me a confidence I'd never had before. I'd always been decisive and confident in military situations, but in my personal life, I'd been a people pleaser who avoided conflict. This experience taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is to refuse to enable their bad behavior, even when it's difficult, even when it causes short-term pain. I'm still serving, still proud of my career choice, and still committed to my country. But now I'm also committed to maintaining healthy relationships and setting appropriate boundaries with people who want to be part of my life. Looking back, I don't regret how I handled the situation. Could I have done things differently? Probably. Could I have been more communicative about my intentions? Maybe. But after years of trying to earn their respect and acceptance through accommodation and understanding, sometimes the only language people understand is consequences. The Christmas they didn't want me to attend turned out to be the Christmas that finally brought my family together, just not in the way any of us expected. And honestly, this Christmas is going to be very different. Lucas Martinez has invited me to spend it with him and his new girlfriend. Megan and Andrew Thompson want me to come to their housewarming party in December. Even my parents have tentatively asked if I'd be willing to join them for Christmas dinner at their apartment. For the first time in years, I actually feel wanted rather than tolerated. It's a strange feeling, but I think I like it. I'm still learning how to be part of a family that actually functions, but it's a much better problem to have than trying to earn love from people who weren't willing to give it freely. Sometimes you have to tear something down completely before you can rebuild it properly. My family learned that lesson the hard way, but we learned it together, and that's made all the difference.